Welcome to the Urban Herald. We're your place for digging into, the really relevant parts of urban life and culture. As part of the team here, we bring you news, features, and thoughtful analysis on everything from lifestyle and entertainment to business, tech, and social issues. And it all comes straight from our own investigative archives.
That's right. We spent a lot of time researching these topics.
Today, we're doing a really rich, in-depth exploration. We're looking at a figure everyone thinks they know, Mahatma Gandhi. But the story, as our deep dive, the hidden side of Mahatma Gandhi, racism, caste, controversies, and Hitler letters, shows, well, it's a lot more complex and sometimes, honestly, pretty unsettling than the image we usually get. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, when you hear the name Mahatma Gandhi or Mahatma Gandhi, the Great Soul, what usually comes to mind. It's this global icon, right?
Absolutely. The leader of Indian independence, nonviolence.
Exactly. Nonviolent resistance.
Mhm.
A symbol of peace, moral leadership. His face is on money, statues everywhere, London, Ghana, you name it. And his influence on huge figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, it's undeniable. He's sort of the embodiment of peaceful revolution for many.
That's the story, isn't it? The one we've all pretty much absorbed. It's almost a saintly picture. But as the team here at the Urban Herald really dug into our archives for this deep dive, what emerged was, frankly, a much more complicated and, troubling figure. This isn't just about adding a few footnotes here and there. It's about facing a Gandhi whose early racist views, his really problematic treatment of women, some very controversial sexual practices, and this rigid authoritarian streak. They paint a picture that's starkly different from the one we were taught.
For those of us who grew up with that, cleaner version, what are some of the really surprising things we're about to get into? And that's exactly what we want to do here. Look, this isn't about tearing down a hero. It's not about erasing his huge contributions in Indian independence, nonviolence globally. Those are massive.
Of course.
But it is about trying to understand the whole person. The hidden side of Gandhi, it reveals contradictions that are, they're fascinating, but they're also deeply uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It makes you grapple with the fact that even the leaders we admire most can have profound moral failings right alongside their greatest triumphs.
Right. It's not black and white.
Not at all. And our exploration, it draws from extensive historical research, documented sources. The goal isn't to diminish his impact, but to present a more complete, more historically accurate picture of this incredibly complex man. We want you to see Gandhi not as some untouchable icon, but as a real person, shaped by his time, his culture, and his own, very human struggles.
Okay, so to give everyone listening a quick taste, maybe, of the journey we're going on, let's just highlight a few points from the timeline. These are things that often get left out of the main story. So picture this. 1893, he arrives in South Africa, a young lawyer. And right away, he's expressing these deeply racist views about black Africans.
Yeah, that's often a shocker for people.
Then jump to 1906. He takes this famous vow of Brahmacharya, celibacy, but he imposes it on his wife, Kasturba, and seemingly without her consent.
A huge point of contention.
Years later, 1939, the world's on the brink of war. And you find him writing a letter to Adolf Hitler, addressing him as dear friend.
Which is just astonishing when you think about it.
And then fast forward again, 1946. Gandhi's 77 years old. And he's doing these things he called experiments with his 18-year-old grandniece, Manu Gandhi. And these involved, sleeping naked together. These are just snapshots, but they really hint at the nuanced and, often unsettling path we're about to explore. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, and maybe the most surprising part for many of you listening, because it challenges the very origin story we have of Gandhi's transformation. We start this deep dive with his early years in South Africa. He gets there in 1893. He's a 24-year-old barrister. And what he brings with him, it isn't necessarily the enlightenment we might expect from a future icon. It's more like the racial hierarchies of his time. And they're actually amplified by his own sense of Indian superiority within that whole colonial setup.
That's such a crucial starting point, because the historical record from that period, honestly, it's unambiguous. Gandhi held deeply, deeply racist views about black Africans for a pretty significant chunk of his time in South Africa. And this was the period that really shaped his early political thinking.
Yeah, right, his formative years.
Yeah, exactly. Take 1893, for instance. He wrote a letter to the natal parliament. And the language he uses, it's quite striking. He complains that, and I'm quoting here, a general belief seems to prevail in the colony that the Indians are a little better, if at all, than savages or the natives of Africa.
Wow.
Yeah. And what's critical to grasp here is he wasn't challenging the racist hierarchy itself. His whole focus was almost entirely on trying to elevate Indians within that existing oppressive system. He wanted to differentiate Indians from Black Africans, not tear down the whole discriminatory structure for everyone. He was basically looking for a better spot for his community within a deeply flawed system, not trying to overturn the system itself.
It really does sound like he was trying to climb the ladder of colonial privilege, maybe find a middle rung, and it gets even more explicit than that general complaint, doesn't it? There's that 1904 letter.
Oh, absolutely. The
Yeah.
1904 letter to a Johannesburg health officer is even more damning. He states quite clearly, about the mixing of the Kaffirs with the Indians, I must confess I feel most strongly.
Using that slur, even.
Using that slur, yes. And the context is he was actively demanding that Black Africans be removed from areas where Indians lived. He was basically arguing for racial segregation. He believed it would benefit his own community, the Indian community, even if it came at the direct expense of Black Africans. He described the African population in other writings as troublesome and very dirty. It just shows this profound lack of empathy and a really deep-seated prejudice at that time. He saw Black Africans almost as an obstacle to Indian aspirations,
Yeah.
rather than, potential allies against colonialism.
So the young Gandhi, he wasn't fighting racism universally. He was, in effect, trying to secure a better deal for Indians within this existing racist structure. And you mentioned he even used things like the Boer War to try and prove Indian loyalty to the British.
Precisely. That's the key takeaway from this early period. He wasn't initially fighting racism in a broad, principled sense. He was strategically maneuvering to get Indians a better position within the colonial hierarchy. He often played up this idea of a shared Indo-Aryan heritage between Indians and Europeans, trying to argue that this supposed common ancestry meant Indians deserve better treatment than Black Africans.
Right, separating them from Africans in the eyes of the colonizers.
Exactly. And you see this very clearly in his actions during the Boer War. He formed an Indian ambulance corps to serve alongside the British forces. Why? He hoped it would prove Indian loyalty, Indian worthiness in the eyes of the British establishment. He was essentially seeking validation within the colonial framework, not challenging its fundamental injustice. He was working with the existing prejudice, not fighting against it across the board.
Now, to be fair, some historians like Ramachandra Guha, they do argue that Gandhi went through a pretty significant personal evolution on this. Guha contends he outgrew his racism quite decisively by his 30s, which sounds like, a positive story of growth.
It does, and there's likely some truth to the idea that his views softened over time. However, this evolution, it seems it was neither complete nor particularly swift. Patrick French, another notable historian, put it very vividly. He called Gandhi's persistent disregard for Africans the black hole at the center of his sanctifying mythology.
That's a strong statement.
It is. And more recent scholarship actually suggests these racist opinions persisted longer than maybe was previously acknowledged. So while the transformation narrative has some basis, it can't just erase the fact that Gandhi spent his crucial formative political years actively advocating for racial segregation and using really derogatory terms like uncivilized and savage to describe Black Africans. And this legacy, you can understand why, it continues to haunt his reputation today.
So it's definitely not just a dusty historical debate then. These early views are still having an impact, creating friction in contemporary movements. Can you give us some examples of how that's playing out now? What stands out to you about how this part of his past keeps coming up?
Oh, it's absolutely a live issue. It really shows how historical figures, even ones revered globally, continue to shape today's social justice conversations. This problematic legacy directly fueled the #GandhiMustFall movement, which, as you mentioned, took inspiration from the Rhodes Must Fall campaign in South Africa. It brought a whole new wave of attention to his early racist views.
And there have been actual statue removals.
Yes, very prominently. In Ghana, back in 2016, a statue of Gandhi was removed from the University of Ghana campus in Accra. This wasn't a random act. It followed sustained petitions from both students and faculty. They specifically cited his derogatory comments about Black Africans from his South African years, arguing that honoring him was basically an insult to the dignity of Black people.
So the words themselves were the issue.
Absolutely. And similarly, in Malawi in 2018, a court actually stepped in with an injunction to halt the planned installation of a Gandhi statue in Blantyre. This happened because activists and lawyers argued very strongly against honoring a figure with such a well-documented history of racism. This whole global reckoning, it really highlights a growing demand for a more authentic, more honest relationship with history. It's about acknowledging complexity and imperfection rather than just sticking to these sanitized myths. It's a powerful reminder of how history isn't static. It's constantly being reevaluated, especially by those most affected by these legacies.
That brings us neatly to another incredibly sensitive and politically charged aspect of Gandhi's hidden side. Perhaps no area is more fiercely debated, especially in modern India, than his really complicated relationship with the caste system. Now, the popular story often paints him as this unwavering crusader against caste discrimination.
Right, the Harijan campaign abolishing untouchability.
Exactly. But the reality, as our research shows, it paints a much more complex picture, one where his reforms were, well, maybe limited, often quite paternalistic, and ultimately perhaps insufficient for those who bore the brunt of caste oppression.
That's a really crucial distinction, and it often gets lost in the simpler narrative. The philosophical battle between Gandhi and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who, remember, was himself a Dalit leader and later became the main architect of India's constitution, this conflict really throws the limitations of Gandhi's approach to caste into sharp relief.
When did this really come to a head?
It climaxed dramatically in 1932. During the Roundtable conferences in London, the British government proposed awarding separate electorates to Dalits, essentially giving Dalits their own distinct voting blocks to ensure they could elect their own representatives, independent of the caste Hindu majority.
Which sounds like a move towards empowerment, right? Giving a marginalized group a direct political voice.
You'd think so. But Gandhi's reaction wasn't supportive. Not at all. He launched a fast unto death in protest against the separate electorates. It was an incredibly dramatic move that sent shockwaves across India and around the world.
Okay, hold on. Why would Gandhi, the champion of the oppressed, oppose something seemingly designed to empower the most marginalized group, the Dalits, by giving them political autonomy?
This is where it gets really complex. His opposition, critically, it wasn't primarily motivated by a desire for Dalit empowerment, as strange as that sounds. It stemmed from his deep-seated fear that separate electorates would fundamentally destroy Hinduism by creating irreparable divisions within the Hindu community.
So it was about Hindu unity over Dalit political rights.
That seems to be the core of it. He saw the Hindu community as this single, indivisible whole. Any division, even one intended to empower the most downtrodden, was, to him, a threat to that unity. His strategic concerns were also pretty clear. Muslims already had separate electorates. If Dalits got them too, he feared the political power of the mainstream caste Hindu leadership, which he represented, would be significantly weakened. He saw it as fracturing the Hindu fold, not as a necessary step towards genuine equality and political agency for Dalits. For him, preserving the unity of Hinduism, as he defined it, took precedence.
And this intense pressure, this fast unto death, you called it moral blackmail earlier, this led to the Poona Pact, right? An agreement between Gandhi and Ambedkar that essentially scrapped the separate electorates.
Exactly. Ambedkar felt he was forced into the Poona Pact under the extreme duress of Gandhi potentially dying. He had to give up the demand for separate electorates, which could have provided genuine political autonomy. Instead, they agreed on reserved seats for Dalits within the general Hindu electorate.
But Ambedkar himself saw flaws in that compromise, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. Ambedkar was acutely aware of the fundamental problem. He pointed out that even with reserved seats, the candidates would still largely be chosen or approved by the upper caste majority voters within those constituencies, so it undermined the possibility of truly independent Dalit leadership and voice. He felt coerced into a compromise that prioritized Gandhi's vision of Hindu unity over what he saw as the path to radical political liberation for Dalits. He was a concession born of immense moral pressure, and its legacy, that debate over representation versus assimilation, continues to fuel political discourse in India today.
And this ties into that really provocative argument from Arundhati Roy, who you mentioned, saying the biggest misconception is that Gandhi fought against the caste system. She claims he actually called it the most genius point of the entire Hindu civilization. That's a direct challenge to his image as a reformer.
It is provocative, and it highlights a critical, often misunderstood nuance in Gandhi's thinking. Gandhi didn't oppose the underlying Varna system itself, the theoretical fourfold division of society based on occupation and innate qualities. Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra. He distinguished this ideal Varna from the rigid, hereditary, and deeply discriminatory caste system, Jati, that had evolved in practice.
So he believed in the theory, but not the practice.
Sort of. He idealized the Varna system. He argued things like the callings of a Brahmin priest scholar and a scavenger are equal, and their due performance carries equal merit before God. This was a highly romanticized, almost spiritual view that completely ignored the brutal lived realities of caste discrimination, the hereditary occupational bondage, the social exclusion, the violence faced by millions, particularly Dalits who were considered outside the Varna system altogether, untouchables. His focus was primarily on abolishing untouchability, the practice of extreme discrimination against Dalits, but not necessarily dismantling the foundational hierarchical structure of Varna that, critics argue, enabled casteism.
And how did Ambedkar respond to that distinction?
Ambedkar saw right through it. His response was devastatingly direct. He said, "If the Mahatma believes, as he does, in everyone following his or her ancestral calling, then most certainly he is advocating the caste system." Ambedkar understood that Gandhi's vision, even his reformed one, would effectively keep the Shudras, the traditional laboring Varna, as the servile class and essentially integrate Dalits into that lowest Shudra Varna, rather than eliminating the inherent hierarchy of caste altogether. For Ambedkar, abolishing untouchability wasn't enough. The entire system of caste hierarchy had to be annihilated. Gandhi wanted reform within the Hindu fold. Ambedkar demanded a radical break. That fundamental difference is why this remains such a charged issue.
Right. Now, moving to another area that causes significant discomfort for many people. Of all Gandhi's hidden practices, and maybe all the aspects we've looked at, none seem more personally disturbing than his so-called experiments in Brahmacharya, or celibacy. And we need to be clear, this term became a euphemism for practices that involved him, an older man sleeping naked with young women, including his own teenage grandniece, claiming it was to test his spiritual purity.
It's deeply uncomfortable territory, absolutely. And the evolution of these practices is, well, quite telling. After he took his vow of celibacy back in 1906, Gandhi seemed to develop increasingly elaborate justifications for maintaining close, intimate physical contact with women, particularly young women in his ashram.
So it wasn't just avoiding sex, it was something more active.
Exactly. His experiments, as he later termed them, apparently began somewhat innocuously, maybe just sleeping in the same room or close proximity. But over time, they evolved into behavior that, by any objective standard, seems like explicit sexual behavior, just disguised or rationalized as a form of spiritual discipline. He claimed these acts were necessary to test his self-control, his detachment from lust and worldly desires. But it involved pushing boundaries far beyond what most would consider acceptable, especially given his age, his status, and the power imbalance with these young women.
Can you give a specific example? The sources mention Sushila Nayak.
Yes, Sushila Nayar's case is often cited. She was his personal physician and also the sister of his secretary, Pirilal. From her girlhood, she reportedly slept in the same bed as Gandhi and even bathed with him. When this was questioned, Gandhi himself offered an explanation that, frankly, sounds more voyeuristic than spiritually detached. He said, "While she is bathing, I keep my eyes tightly shut. I do not know whether she bathes naked or with her underwear on. I can tell from the sound that she uses soap."
Doesn't sound like detachment.
It really doesn't. It points to, at best, a very unusual fixation, and at worst, a deeply problematic dynamic, especially considering the age difference and his immense authority over her.
And then there's the most controversial instance, the one involving his grandniece, Manu Gandhi. This was late in his life, December 1946. He was 77, she was just 18.
Yes, the Manu Gandhi experiment is perhaps the most widely discussed and condemned. The context makes it even more troubling. This was during the height of the pre-partition communal violence in Noakhali. Gandhi reportedly told Manu, and this is according to accounts from his circle, something to the effect of, "We both may be killed by the Muslims and must put our purity to the ultimate test so that we know that we are offering the purest of sacrifices, and we should now both start sleeping naked."
He's linking this intimate act directly to a political crisis and martyrdom.
Precisely. He framed it as a necessary act of spiritual purification in the face of potential death and communal violence. It conflated his intensely personal and questionable celibacy test with the fate of the nation, which is a staggering justification.
So how did he actually define Brahmacharya to allow for this? It seems like a contradiction in terms.
Well, that's the crux of it. He essentially redefined Brahmacharya to fit his own practices. His definition became highly idiosyncratic and, frankly, self-serving. He argued that a true Brahmacharya wasn't just someone who abstained from sex, but someone who never has any lustful intention, who is capable of lying naked with naked women, however beautiful, without being in any manner whatsoever sexually excited.
So the test was the proximity to temptation while remaining internally pure.
That was his claim. It allowed him to frame these encounters not as lapses, but as proof of his supreme spiritual mastery and detachment. But critics, understandably, saw this as a way for him to engage in highly inappropriate behavior while claiming moral high ground, especially given the clear power imbalance. He was the Mahatma, the revered leader. These were young, devoted, often vulnerable women.
That kind of twisted logic definitely points to that authoritarian streak you mentioned earlier. But surely people around him must have objected. His staff, his family. What happened when they questioned these experiments?
Oh, there was absolutely internal dissent. Significant dissent. Staff members, including his longtime personal secretary Pierre Lowell, and even members of his own family, raised strong objections. They were deeply disturbed by what was happening.
And how did Gandhi react to their concerns?
His reaction is incredibly revealing. Instead of reconsidering his actions or acknowledging their discomfort, Gandhi reportedly treated their concerns as further proof of the necessity of the experiments. He essentially argued that their objections show their own moral weakness or lack of spiritual understanding. He's quoted as dismissively saying something like, "If I don't let Manu sleep with me, though I regard it as essential that she should, wouldn't that be a sign of weakness in me?"
Wow. So any criticism just reinforced his belief he was right.
Exactly. It's this astonishing capacity for self-rationalization, where any challenge to his methods was just reinterpreted as validation for continuing them. It shows a profound authoritarian streak and an unwillingness to be questioned, even by those closest to him.
And there's that critical detail you brought up. Sushila Nair, one of the women involved, later revealed that the specific term Brahmacharya experiment was only coined after people started questioning Gandhi's behavior. She apparently admitted in the early days there was no question of calling this a Brahmacharya experiment.
That admission is incredibly telling, isn't it? It strongly suggests that, like maybe many powerful figures throughout history, Gandhi essentially invented the justification after the fact. He retroactively applied this spiritual framework to rationalize behavior that was already occurring and drawing criticism. It highlights a really troubling pattern of using spiritual language to mask or excuse potentially exploitative actions, blurring the lines between genuine spiritual seeking and the exercise of unchallenged authority over followers who implicitly trusted him. This redefinition wasn't just a theological quirk, it looks like a chilling example of power justifying itself.
And it's important to stress Gandhi's treatment of women, it wasn't just confined to these sexual experiments. It seems to have extended into a broader worldview that many today would describe as deeply misogynistic and certainly harmful to women's rights and safety. His views on things like menstruation, contraception, even sexual violence, they reveal a side of him that starkly contrasts with his image as a progressive liberator.
That's absolutely right. The experiments are perhaps the most sensational aspect, but his underlying views on women were problematic in several key areas. One of the most, frankly, abhorrent was his belief that women were somehow inherently responsible for sexual assault committed against them. He seemed to imply that their dress, their behavior, even their presence could invite male aggression.
That's classic victim blaming.
Textbook victim blaming. And we see this reflected directly in his actions. Remember that incident in his South African ashram where harassment occurred? His solution wasn't to address the male behavior. It was to cut the hair of his female followers, as if their appearance was the problem, not the actions of the men. It's a mindset that, rather than challenging patriarchal norms, actually reinforced them.
And it got even worse than that, didn't it? His views on the consequences of rape.
Yes. Even more devastatingly, Gandhi held the belief that rape victims somehow lost their intrinsic value as human beings, becoming soiled or damaged goods. He went so far as to argue in some contexts that fathers could be justified in killing daughters who had been sexually abused in order to preserve the family's or community's honor.
That's horrifying.
It is. This mentality, equating a woman's worth with her perceived sexual purity and placing the entire burden of shame on the victim, has had devastatingly long-lasting consequences. Its echoes are tragically still present in parts of contemporary India and other societies, where attitudes often prioritize family reputation over a survivor's well-being and justice. It cements a deeply harmful approach that protects perpetrators and punishes victims.
And then there's his very public stance against contraception. He had that famous meeting in 1935 with Margaret Sanger, the American birth control pioneer. That meeting really highlighted the clash between his traditional views and the burgeoning movement for women's reproductive rights. What was his position?
His opposition to birth control wasn't just a preference. It was absolute and, frankly, quite harmful, especially given the context of poverty and high birth rates in India. During that meeting with Sanger, and in his writings, he rejected artificial contraceptives entirely. His argument was that they were unnatural, that they would lead to his words, frightful results, turning people into mental and moral wrecks, because he believed they would encourage sexual indulgence without consequence. So he saw it purely as a moral issue, ignoring the health or economic aspects for women, pretty much. He even labeled women who use contraceptives, regardless of their marital status or reasons, as tantamount to prostitutes. His proposed solution to unwanted pregnancies was solely male self-control, abstinence achieved through sheer willpower. He completely ignored female autonomy, bodily integrity, and the incredibly difficult realities of women's lives, particularly poor women. His stance effectively condemned women to potentially endless cycles of childbearing or forced them towards dangerous, unsafe methods of family limitation. It profoundly disregarded their right to control their own bodies and futures.
What stands out to you personally as maybe the most surprising or troubling view he held about women, particularly regarding just basic biology?
For me, perhaps the most telling and frankly bizarre were Gandhi's views on menstruation. He didn't just see it as a biological process. He actually viewed menstruation as, and this is almost hard to believe, a manifestation of the distortion of a woman's soul by her sexuality.
A distortion of the soul.
Yes, he pathologized a completely normal, healthy female biological function. It reveals the alarming extent to which his supposedly spiritual worldview was actually permeated by a deep-seated misogyny and a fundamental, almost willful misunderstanding of women's bodies. It wasn't just cultural conservatism, it was biologically unsound and deeply demeaning.
So what did he think should happen?
He genuinely seemed to believe that women, in an ideal pure state, shouldn't menstruate at all. He saw it as a sign of impurity, a deviation from a natural state of purity that was somehow linked to sexual desire. This view is so disconnected from biological reality that it borders on the delusional. And this attempt to impose his own personal sexual hang-ups and extreme ascetic ideals onto women's natural physiological functions, it powerfully demonstrates that authoritarian streak we keep coming back to. It was about imposing his rigid purity code on everyone, trying to control even the most natural aspects of human existence in a way that was both scientifically absurd and profoundly dehumanizing for women.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Gandhi's economic philosophy. Now, it was undeniably influential, especially during the independence movement, but there's a strong argument that it might have actually hindered India's development after 1947. This came largely from his romantic opposition to industrialization and modern technology. He famously declared, "God forbid that India should ever take to industrialization after the manner of the West." That's a pretty strong statement against the path most nations were taking.
It is a very strong statement, and it reflects a core part of his worldview. The charkha, the spinning wheel, became the potent symbol of this philosophy, representing self-reliance, dignity of labor, resistance to British manufactured goods, and it was powerful symbolically.
Absolutely, as a symbol of resistance.
Hugely powerful. And practically, hand spinning did provide some supplementary employment, especially in rural areas, during the freedom struggle. It fostered a sense of self-dignity, which was important. But, and this is the crucial point economists raise, it could never realistically address the massive scale of India's systemic poverty and widespread unemployment. It was essentially a local, small-scale solution proposed for a problem that required macroeconomic intervention, large-scale industrialization to create jobs, generate wealth, and lift millions out of poverty.
So the symbol was powerful, but the economics were perhaps questionable.
That's the critique. Even sympathetic economists pointed out its limitations. Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, back in 1957, actually demonstrated through economic analysis that the government promoted Ambar Charkha, an improved spinning wheel designed to boost productivity, was actually destroying value rather than creating it.
How so?
Because the cost of the labor and the raw materials involved often exceeded the actual market value of the cloth being produced. It was inefficient and, Sen argued, led to inflation and actually impeded capital accumulation needed for broader development. And it wasn't just economists. Rabindranath Tagore, Gandhi's great contemporary and sometimes critic, questioned quite eloquently whether India's deep poverty could really be tackled by what he saw as mechanical and ritualistic spinning on a primitive wheel, especially when India needed to find its place in a rapidly modernizing world. Gandhi's obsession with village self-sufficiency, while having a certain moral appeal, arguably ignored the complex realities of economic interdependence and the massive benefits of specialization that drive modern economies.
So what were the longer-term implications then? When leaders like Nehru actually had to build a modern nation-state after independence, how did this anti-industrial philosophy play out?
Well, Gandhi's economic thinking, which is heavily influenced by, Victorian-era critics of industrialism like John Ruskin and Thomas Carlyle, was really built more on moral and spiritual concerns than on pragmatic economic logic. His vision of these completely self-reliant village republics, while idyllic on paper, some argue it inadvertently strengthened feudalistic agrarian structures and definitely impeded the kind of rapid modernization and industrialization that many felt India desperately needed to combat poverty and compete globally.
So it created a kind of ideological barrier.
Yes, exactly. While Nehru, India's first prime minister, ultimately did pursue a path of state-led industrialization, Gandhi's ideas had instilled a deep skepticism about large-scale industry and capitalism within India's political culture. Some argue this significantly slowed down necessary economic reforms for decades. The continued emphasis on small-scale cottage industries, while having some niche benefits, meant India struggled for a long time to build a robust, globally competitive manufacturing base capable of providing jobs and generating wealth at the scale required. It impacted India's growth trajectory and its ability to tackle unemployment effectively.
And there was a contradiction in his own approach to technology, wasn't there?
There was a stark contradiction. He wasn't uniformly anti-technology. For instance, he famously accepted and even promoted the Singer sewing machine, seeing it as a tool that could empower women and aid self-reliance in the home. But then he'd rail against other forms of machinery and factory production. The problem was he never really offered a clear, coherent principle for distinguishing between good technology and bad technology. It seems quite arbitrary. This lack of a consistent framework left his followers and policymakers influenced by his ideas, without clear guidance for navigating the complexities of the modern technological world. It created a philosophical hurdle to embracing innovations that could have spurred development. His vision was incredibly potent symbolically, but perhaps less useful as a practical economic blueprint for a modern nation.
Now, turning to perhaps one of the most astonishing and frankly perplexing aspects of Gandhi's hidden side, his direct correspondence with Adolf Hitler. This really reveals a level of political naivety, or perhaps something else, that bordered on the dangerous, especially given the timing.
It's truly remarkable and deeply unsettling to read those letters today. Gandhi's decision in both 1939 and 1940 to address Hitler as "dear friend," it wasn't just a polite formality. It stemmed directly from his core belief that he had no enemies, a central tenet of his ahimsa philosophy.
A spiritual principle applied to international politics.
Exactly. And while that principle might be spiritually admirable on a personal level, applying it to a figure like Hitler, who operated entirely outside any recognizable moral framework, proved politically, well, catastrophic in its implications. Consider his 1940 letter not just to Hitler, but his public appeal to the British people around the same time, urging them to essentially lay down their arms and accept whatever fate Hitler decided for them.
Which would have meant what?
It would have meant surrendering Britain and likely all of Europe to Nazi domination. It's an almost unimaginable outcome, handing Hitler total victory without further struggle. It stemmed from this deeply ingrained, dangerous assumption that moral force, that satyagraha, could somehow overcome any opponent, regardless of their ideology or utter ruthlessness.
Even someone orchestrating genocide.
Apparently so. His advice to European Jews, suggesting they practice nonviolent resistance against the Nazis, showed a profound, almost willful misunderstanding of the nature of genocidal ideology. It demonstrated the absolute limits of nonviolent resistance when confronting those who recognize no moral constraints, who are committed to systematic extermination. Giving that advice, in that context, is particularly chilling when you look back.
So was his stance during the war just pure pacifism? Or was it more complicated than that?
It was definitely more complicated and strategically very confused, maybe even contradictory. He wasn't just a pacifist in the sense of opposing all war. He strongly opposed British participation in World War II without India's free consent, arguing India shouldn't be dragged into Britain's war. That was a principled anti-colonial stance. But simultaneously and paradoxically, by advising Britain to surrender and appealing to Hitler as a friend who could choose peace, he was in effect offering Hitler the potential fruits of a British defeat. This wasn't principled nonviolence offering a viable alternative path. It inadvertently became a form of indirect collaboration with fascism, regardless of his intentions.
So Churchill's famous dismissal wasn't entirely off base.
Winston Churchill's scathing dismissal of Gandhi as a seditious fakir who offered to mediate Britain's surrender to Hitler, while obviously loaded political rhetoric, wasn't entirely unfair based on the content of Gandhi's appeals. And perhaps most damningly, in May 1940, the very month Churchill became prime minister and Britain faced the Nazi onslaught virtually alone, Gandhi made comments describing Hitler as not a bad man. This revealed a level of moral blindness or perhaps a desperate clinging to his philosophy in the face of its clear irrelevance that could have had truly catastrophic consequences for civilization itself if his advice had actually been followed.
To really understand the depth of this, let's look more closely at the letters themselves. The first one was sent July 23, 1939, from Warda, just weeks before the invasion of Poland.
Right, and the opening itself sets this strange tone of familiarity and deference. He writes, "Dear friend, friends have been urging me to write to you for the sake of humanity, but I have resisted their request because of the feeling that any letter from me would be an impertinence." He almost apologizes for writing, but feels compelled. He continues, "Something tells me that I must not calculate and that I must make my appeal for whatever it may be worth."
And then he gets to the core message.
Yes, he immediately positions Hitler as the single person holding the fate of the world. "It is quite clear that you are today the one person in the world who can prevent a war which may reduce humanity to the savage state. It's an extraordinary burden and power to place on one individual, especially that individual." Then comes the plea. "Must you pay that price for an object, however worthy it may appear to you to be? Will you listen to the appeal of one who has deliberately shunned the method of war, not without considerable success?" He's appealing to Hitler's sense of reason, appealing based on his own success with nonviolence, seemingly oblivious to the complete mismatch in their worldviews. He ends it. "Anyway, I anticipate your forgiveness if I have erred in writing to you. I remain your sincere friend, M.K. Gandhi." Addressed simply to Herr Hitler, Berlin, Germany. It's a plea rooted in conviction, but tragically naive and misdirected.
And then the second letter, December 24, 1940, also from Warda. This is over a year later. The war is raging in Europe. France has fallen. The Battle of Britain has happened.
Exactly. The context is even darker. And yet he opens again with that startling address. "Dear friend, that I address you as a friend is no formality. I own no foes." He explains his life's mission. "My business in life has been for the past 33 years to enlist the friendship of the whole of humanity by befriending mankind, irrespective of race, color, or creed." He hopes Hitler will have the time and desire to understand this perspective. He's basically presenting himself as this ambassador of universal friendship to the architect of racial extermination.
Does he acknowledge what Hitler has actually done by this point?
He does, which makes the letter even more complex. He demonstrates he's not entirely ignorant, yet his framing is still peculiar. He writes, "We have no doubt about your bravery or devotion to your fatherland, nor do we believe that you are the monster described by your opponents." He explicitly rejects the monster label. But then he continues, "But your own writings and pronouncements and those of your friends and admirers leave no room for doubt that many of your acts are monstrous and unbecoming of human dignity. Such are your humiliation of Czechoslovakia, the rape of Poland, and the swallowing of Denmark." So he condemns the acts as monstrous, but seems reluctant to condemn the man himself in the same terms.
And it's in this letter he draws that parallel between Nazism and British imperialism.
Yes, and this was and remains deeply controversial. He writes, "We resist British imperialism no less than Nazism. If there is a difference, it is in degree." End quote. He acknowledges Britain's rule over India involved means that will not bear scrutiny. But then he positions India's struggle. "Our resistance to it does not mean harm to the British people. We seek to convert them, not to defeat them on the battlefield. Ours is an unarmed revolt." This comparison, suggesting the difference between centuries of British colonial exploitation and the rapid genocidal expansionism of Nazi Germany was merely one of degree, struck many then and now as a profound moral and historical misjudgment, downplaying the unique evil of the Nazi regime.
He also really pushes the idea of nonviolence as the superior force in this letter, right? Almost presenting it as a weapon Hitler should recognize.
He does, with incredible, almost desperate conviction. He spends a significant portion explaining satyagraha. "No spoliator can compass his end without a certain degree of cooperation. Our rulers may have our land and bodies, but not our souls. If a fair number of men and women be found in India who would be prepared without any ill will against the spoliators to lay down their lives rather than bend the knee to them, they would have shown the way to freedom from the tyranny of violence." He tells Hitler he'll find many such people in India. Then he says directly, "We have founded nonviolence a force which, if organized, can without doubt match itself against a combination of all the most violent forces in the world." He calls it a technique where there is no such thing as defeat. He even contrasts it with Hitler's methods. It can be used practically without money and obviously without the aid of science of destruction, which you have brought to such perfection. He warns Hitler, "If not the British, Some other power will certainly improve upon your method and beat you with your own weapon. You are leaving no legacy to your people of which they would feel proud. It's this long, impassioned plea, showcasing his unwavering faith in nonviolence, but directed at someone utterly incapable of grasping, let alone valuing its principles.
And how does he conclude this second extraordinary letter?
He ends with another direct appeal for peace and a practical suggestion, still clinging to the idea of mediation. I, therefore, appeal to you in the name of humanity to stop the war. You will lose nothing by referring all the matters of dispute between you and Great Britain to an international tribunal of your joint choice. He argues that winning the war won't prove Hitler right, only that his power of destruction was greater, whereas an impartial tribunal could show who was truly in the right. He reminds Hitler he made a similar appeal to the British because the British know me as a friend though a rebel, but admits he's a stranger to Hitler. He mentions suspending India's own struggle during the Christmas season and asks if it's too much to ask you to make an effort for peace. He even says he intended to address a joint appeal to Hitler and Mussolini. He signed off again, I am your sincere friend, M.K. Jandy H.I. It's just a remarkable document revealing deep moral conviction, but also a tragic disconnect from the brutal reality of the man he was addressing.
Okay. Moving on from these global political misjudgments, let's zoom back into his personal sphere. It's fascinating, and maybe unsettling, to learn that behind that very gentle, almost universally recognized public image of Gandhi, there seems to have been a distinct authoritarian personality, one that demanded absolute obedience and could impose surprisingly harsh punishments, especially within his ashrams, for even minor mistakes.
That's a really crucial point, and it definitely clashes with the popular perception of this perpetually mild, compassionate figure. Gandhi's authoritarianism, it often showed up in ways that might seem trivial on the surface, but were actually very revealing about his character and his need for control over his immediate environment and his followers.
What are some examples?
Well, there's an anecdote about his son, Harilal. Apparently, Harilal rounded off the time by just a single minute when recording something. Gandhi didn't just gently correct him. He reportedly flew into a completely disproportionate rage and delivered this incredibly lengthy sermon about the profound moral dangers of lying, going way beyond what you'd expect for such a tiny infraction. It showed this demand for absolute, almost obsessive adherence to his strict moral code, even in the most minute details.
So zero tolerance for deviation, even unintentional.
It seems so in certain respects. And then there's that incident involving the Dalit girl, Lakshmi, which reveals a really shocking lack of empathy and respect for personal autonomy. She arrived late for prayers, apparently because she was combing her hair. As punishment, Gandhi personally cut off her hair, and the critical part is, this was done seemingly without her consent.
He just cut her hair.
That's the account. He likely saw it as a necessary lesson in discipline, prioritizing prayer over personal vanity. But for Lakshmi, it must have been a deeply humiliating and violating experience, an assault on her person and appearance by the very leaders she looked up to. These aren't the actions of someone who consistently respected individual boundaries. They highlight a controlling nature where his will, his rules were absolute within his circle.
And his treatment of his wife, Kasturba, seems like a particularly stark example of this authoritarian streak playing out in his closest relationship. We touched on the imposed celibacy, but the sources describe incidents that sound like outright emotional abuse.
His treatment of Kasturba was, by his own account sometimes, particularly harsh. And what's maybe most revealing is that he documented some of these incidents himself in his autobiography, seemingly without fully recognizing or acknowledging the abuse inherent in his actions.
Like the incident at the gate.
Exactly. He describes an argument over her reluctance to clean the chamber pot of a guest, something that violated her own caste sensibilities at the time. He writes about literally dragging her to their front gate, physically, and threatening to throw her out of the house over it. He even describes seeing tears running down her cheeks in torrents. His later reflection on such incidents, where he essentially says something like, "The wife, with her matchless powers of endurance, has always been the victor," comes across as a deeply dismissive rationalization. It completely fails to acknowledge the intimidation, the humiliation, the emotional abuse inherent in that kind of behavior. It paints a picture very different from the compassionate partner, showing a man who demanded total conformity from those closest to him, sometimes through coercion.
And this authoritarian approach, it clearly extended beyond just household rules into imposing his core values, like celibacy, on others without their agreement. You mentioned he imposed celibacy on Kasturba without her consent. That just feels like such a fundamental violation.
It absolutely was. That decision to unilaterally impose his vow of celibacy onto Kasturba, expecting her to adhere to it, regardless of her own feelings, desires, or consent, is a prime example of his authoritarian approach within personal relationships. It fundamentally denied her agency over her own body and life choices. His spiritual journey superseded her individual will.
And his descriptions of her.
His descriptions of her in his writings are often quite dismissive, even condescending. Calling her expression dull cow-like, or frequently referring to her supposed ignorance, it reveals an underlying contempt that often sat uncomfortably alongside his public pronouncements about partnership and mutual respect. It suggests he often saw her, and perhaps other women too, primarily as helpmates or instruments for his own spiritual and political goals, rather than as fully autonomous individuals with their own intrinsic worth and desires.
So there's a clear pattern emerging here.
The broader pattern seems clear, yes. Gandhi expected others, especially those within his intimate circle and ashrams, to conform completely to his moral vision, his rules, his lifestyle, regardless of their own wishes, well-being, or even their basic human rights. This authoritarianism, often masked or justified by the language of spiritual discipline, self-sacrifice, or the greater good, appears to have created a culture of fear and submission around him. And that reality profoundly contradicts the gentle, egalitarian image that has been so widely and successfully propagated. His ashrams, while undoubtedly centers of important social and political work, were also highly controlled environments where his word was essentially law and dissent often wasn't tolerated.
Okay, let's move towards the end of his life. Gandhi's assassination in 1948 at the hands of the Hindu nationalist Nathuram Godse was obviously a profound tragedy. But it was also incredibly revealing, wasn't it? It exposed the deep, violent fissures in Indian society at that moment of independence and partition, a terrible irony for the apostle of nonviolence.
A terrible and profound irony. Nathuram Godse's stated motivation for killing Gandhi, that Gandhi was too pro-Muslim, that he had betrayed Hindus during partition, especially by insisting that India pay funds owed to the newly created Pakistan amidst the violence. This accusation itself exposed the incredibly dangerous pre-existing tensions that Gandhi's complex and sometimes contradictory political balancing act had, perhaps unwittingly, helped to fuel, particularly among Hindu fundamentalist groups.
So Godse saw him as a traitor to the Hindu cause?
Exactly. Godse and his collaborators felt Gandhi was appeasing Muslims at the expense of Hindus, undermining the concept of a Hindu nation they envisioned. And the final bitter irony of his death is that Gandhi died much as he had lived, especially in those final heartbreaking years, caught between fiercely competing demands and ultimately satisfying almost none of them completely. Hindu nationalists like Godse saw him as a traitor. At the same time, many Muslims questioned his commitment to their safety and rights in the new India, feeling he hadn't done enough to prevent the horrific violence of partition that disproportionately affected them. His grand vision of a united, secular, peaceful India had tragically collapsed into the bloodbath of partition, leaving him isolated, deeply saddened, and a target for extremists on both sides, though ultimately killed by one from his own religious community.
And there's that incredibly powerful detail about the aftermath. The execution of Godse and his co-conspirator Narayan Apte. It came despite pleas for clemency for their lives to be spared from Gandhi's own sons, Manolal and Ramdas. They argued against the death penalty, even for their father's murderers.
That decision by his sons is just a stunning final testament to the core principle of nonviolence that Gandhi lived and died, for a principle that his killers could never comprehend, let alone embrace. His sons embodied his teaching in the face of unimaginable personal grief and loss. Yet, the profound and chilling paradox remains. The very movement of Hindu nationalism that produced Godse was itself inspired, however selectively and perversely, by readings of Hindu tradition, the same tradition Gandhi drew upon. Godse, a devout Hindu himself, tragically believed he was acting righteously to save Hinduism from Gandhi's perceived betrayal. It starkly reveals the inherent contradictions within Gandhi's complex legacy, how even his own philosophical roots could be twisted to justify extreme violence against him. It's a sobering reminder that even the most noble ideals can be distorted and weaponized.
Now, for all these flaws, these contradictions, the problematic views and actions we've explored today in this deep dive, it feels important to also acknowledge the other side. Sources do suggest Gandhi retained a compelling sense of humor, a certain human warmth that really complicates any simple, easy, black and white judgment of his character. We need to see that dimension too, right?
Absolutely. It's crucial for a balanced picture. His apparently witty correspondence with Winston Churchill, for example, offers glimpses of a lighter side,
a real sharpness of mind and a capacity for intellectual sparring that often gets lost beneath the image of the solemn, ascetic Mahatma. And his deeply held conviction, that declaration that he had no enemies, while politically naive as we discussed, also speaks to a certain expansive spirit. His ability at times to laugh at himself, despite shouldering the immense weight of the Indian independence movement, it provides these moments of a more appealing, perhaps more relatable personality beneath the sometimes rigid moral framework he imposed.
So moments of grace, even amidst the harshness.
Exactly. You see this humanity shining through even in really challenging interactions. His letter back to Churchill, after Churchill had delivered some famously harsh public criticisms of him, wasn't defensive or bitter. By many accounts, it showed a remarkable capacity for a gracious, even slightly humorous response to personal attack, and maybe even revisiting that opening of his letters to Hitler, my dear friend. While we've analyzed the profound political naivety, perhaps it also reflected not just naivety alone, but a genuine, almost stubborn belief in the possibility of human transformation, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. It reveals an ingrained optimism, however tragically misplaced in that instance, that was undeniably part of his unique character, a refusal to completely demonize anyone, which was perhaps both a source of his strength and, in cases like Hitler, a profound and dangerous weakness.
And these controversies, these complexities we've been discussing, they aren't just locked away in history books, are they? They are actively playing out today. We're seeing modern protests, demands for the removal of his statues across the globe. It's forcing this contemporary reevaluation of how we remember and honor historical figures. The hashtag Gandhi Must Fall movement you mentioned earlier is a key example, drawing direct inspiration from South Africa's Rhodes Must Fall campaign and putting his early racist views firmly back in the spotlight.
That's exactly right. This isn't just academic debate, it has very real-world consequences and is sparking vital conversations about historical memory and public commemoration in numerous countries. Ghana, as we discussed, is a prime example from 2016. Students and faculty at the University of Ghana successfully campaigned for a Gandhi statue removal from their campus. Their argument was direct. His documented derogatory comments about Black Africans during his South African years made honoring him on African soil deeply offensive and inconsistent with the university's values. It showed that words from the past carry real weight and harm in the present.
And Malawi, too.
And Malawi in 2018, yes. A court actually issued an injunction to stop a planned Gandhi statue installation in Blantyre. Again, this followed strong protests from local activists and lawyers who argued forcefully against honoring a figure with what they termed a documented history of racism. They felt his legacy in an African context was one racial hierarchy, not universal liberation. This whole global reckoning, it really underscores the lasting impact of Gandhi's early prejudices, but also more broadly, it reflects this growing demand for more complete, more honest acknowledgement of the complexities, the flaws, and failures alongside the triumphs of all historical figures. It's a powerful lesson that historical narratives aren't fixed. They are constantly being contested and reevaluated, especially by communities who have been marginalized by those traditional narratives.
So after digging deep into his life, his choices, the profound impact of both his incredible triumphs and his significant, often hidden failures, we circle back to that central, difficult question: what do you listening do with a hero who has such a profound, complicated hidden side?
It's a fundamental question, isn't it? Gandhi's story, in its full, unvarnished complexity, really forces us to confront a difficult truth. That great historical figures are almost never saints. They are complex, often contradictory human beings, capable of immense inspiration and, yes, deeply troubling actions or beliefs, often simultaneously.
So the hidden side doesn't just cancel out the good.
No, I don't think it does. The hidden side of Gandhi doesn't negate his monumental achievements, his absolutely pivotal role in India's independence, his development and popularization of nonviolent resistance as a powerful political tool that literally changed the world, his undeniable influence on civil rights movements globally. Those things remain historically significant. They are real. But, and this is the crucial but, neither can those achievements simply excuse or erase his documented racism, his misogyny, his authoritarian tendencies, or his questionable sexual practices. We have to be able to hold both sets of truths at the same time, acknowledging the full, often uncomfortable spectrum of his humanity.
And maybe the most troubling part of his legacy, especially looking back from our perspective here at the Urban Herald, is how effectively it has been sanitized over the decades, how it's been mythologized, turning this deeply flawed, complex human being into an almost untouchable plaster saint.
Precisely. And that process of sanitization, of myth-making, is actually
quite dangerous. It makes it incredibly difficult for us to learn genuinely from both his successes and his failures in equal measure. When we create these false idols, rather than engaging with complex historical figures, warts and all, we lose the opportunity to draw the more nuanced and, frankly, more useful and relevant lessons from their lives.
It stops us from learning, maybe.
It does. It strips away the very human struggles, the mistakes, the moral compromises that make historical figures relatable and truly instructive. When we idealize, we stop thinking critically. We avoid confronting those uncomfortable truths about power, about prejudice, about personal fallibility truths that are present not just in historical leaders, but potentially in our own societies, and even in ourselves.
It's interesting when you really lay it all out, Gandhi's contradictions seem to mirror the contradictions of his own time, the colonial era, the nationalist struggle. And maybe, in many ways, they even mirror our own time, too. It forces a bit of self-reflection.
I think they absolutely do. His unique, sometimes jarring combination of a progressive political vision liberation for India, alongside, at times, deeply regressive social attitudes towards caste and gender. His genuine, undeniable spiritual seeking existing alongside profound personal failings and ethically dubious practices. His absolute commitment to truth, with a capital P, coupled with what seems like a surprising capacity for self-deception or rationalization. All of this, it really reflects the inherent complexity, the messiness of human nature itself. And it highlights the immense difficulty of moral leadership, especially when operating on a global stage where the personal and the political are constantly, inevitably intertwined.
So, the hidden side of Gandhi. Maybe it ultimately serves as this powerful reminder that heroes aren't just born perfect, they are made, often through struggle, and that the process of heroic myth-making itself often obscures the very human flaws and battles that make these figures both relatable and ultimately more instructive for us today.
Exactly. In confronting Gandhi's full complexity, the light and the shadow, we don't need to diminish his contributions, nor should we excuse his failures. We simply try to see him as he likely was, a man whose extraordinary world-changing impact on history was achieved despite, and maybe even partly because of, his profound human limitations and contradictions. The real question isn't whether Gandhi was good or evil. That's too simplistic. It's whether we, looking back with the knowledge we have now, can learn from the entirety of his story, darkness and light, together. Can we use that understanding to build a more honest, maybe more effective, certainly more self-aware approach to social change today?
A challenging thought to end on.
Perhaps, in the end, that's the most valuable lesson his hidden side can offer us. That real moral leadership isn't about achieving some mythical state of perfection. It's about the ongoing, difficult, often messy struggle to align our highest ideals and aspirations with our all-too-human realities and failings.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive here on the Urban Herald. We hope it gave you plenty to think about. We invite you to continue your journey of informed understanding with future explorations from the Urban Herald team.